Welcome to our Bible study. We're going to be looking at the fifth chapter of James tonight, verses 1 through 6. Before we enter into our study, I'd like to remind us again of some of the resources that are available to us. For our Sunday worship services, if you're unable to be with us physically in the building or outside in our worship service, or if you're unable to worship with us virtually, there's other options for you. DirecTV on Sundays at 7:30 on Channel 47 has In Search of the Lord's Way with Phil Sanders. Dish TV on Sunday at 7:30 on Channel 239 also has the same program. Spectrum Cable at the same time on Channel 3 has the exact same program. Gospel Broadcasting Network, gbntv.org, and also World Video Bible School, video.wvbs.org. Both of these resources have a large amount of material, different books of the Bible you can study through. There's sermons on there. There's different worship services, different types of things available. So there are many things very easy for us to access. And obviously, we want to continue to study God's Word in these difficult times, even when we cannot always get together physically. We come down to James, the fifth chapter. And as I've always mentioned as we go through the book of James, it's an extremely practical book. James talks about how we deal with each other on a daily basis. And I think it only makes sense that in a book which deals with the practical in and out of daily living, that you cover something concerning riches and wealthy people and poor people. The book of Proverbs recognizes that there are going to be differences in how people live in this world. Some are always going to have more than others. And the Bible has always reminded us that those who are the poorest in the country, those who maybe need our help the most, we need to reach out to. Of course, there's other issues involved when we think of this. The book of Proverbs talks about the need to not trust in riches, the need to care about the poor, but also the need to work, the need for us to work hard to prepare for the time when winter. Solomon says, "Go to the ant, thou fool," and he works hard in the summer so he has something in the winter. And so when you cover the issue of rich poor, you cover different kind of sins involved in this. Obviously, rich people can be guilty of sins, poor people can be guilty of sins. But what's described here is basically James seems to have just sort of a blanket condemnation of the rich. And we'll cover this in a little bit later on in our lesson, that God does not condemn an individual simply for having wealth, having more than other individuals. But God's very clear that those individuals who are wealthy definitely have a greater responsibility in making sure that they are stewards of what they have and don't trust in these riches. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You've heaped up treasure in the last days. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the just. He doesn't resist you. When I read that first verse, it reminded me of the story of Lazarus and the rich man. We know the story Jesus tells in the Gospel of Luke. Here's a poor beggar who is completely dependent on what other people can give him. And obviously, the rich man is an opulent, wealthy type person, has more than enough to eat. This beggar who has leprosy, he says he lays at the table and the dogs come and lick the sores of this individual. And in this world, Lazarus was suffering, but in this world, the rich man was not suffering. But then things are reversed in eternity. In eternity, Lazarus is being blessed. Lazarus obviously is in glory, but on the other hand, the rich man is suffering. And so the rich who are described here are individuals who, they maybe seem to have a good position in life right now, but eventually they're going to have to answer to God for how they have treated their laborers and others. The fact that what they have is eventually going to rot, and also the idea that there are various sins tied into what they were involved in. The question I think that we have to ask ourselves is James condemning the rich for being rich, or is there more to it than that? Again, as we'll see toward the end of our lesson, the Bible does not condemn rich people per se. Abraham was an extremely wealthy person. Job, also in the Old Testament, seemed to have quite a bit of money. We find in the New Testament that Aquila and Priscilla were wealthy people who lived in two different cities, and the church was large enough to meet in their house, regardless of what size that house was. But by and large, most of the early Christians were not wealthy people. They're made up of maybe we might say if there's even a middle class, a lower class of society. And so when we look at the Bible does not condemn a rich man for being rich per se, but he does condemn those who are rich who get that way through sin and through oppressing other people. And that's what's being described here. This section of James appears to be just a general warning against the wicked rich and not just addressing Christians. Especially in our day and age, it seems to be a popular thing just to attack those who are wealthier than we are. And to some degree, this is envy. And we shouldn't envy those who are wicked. Some people are very wealthy because they've worked very hard all their lives. They were very honest in what they've done. They've simply been good users of money. They know how to make money. And this is not inherently sinful. Other people can be wealthy through cutting corners, through cheating others, stealing from others, and obviously that's condemned. But it seems here in James 5, he seems to make a blanket condemnation of the rich, but that's not true. That not just because a person is wealthy is he condemned by God. But this is a parallel in this section to some of the Old Testament prophets' condemnations. And we'll look at some of the teaching in the Old Testament about how in that culture, those who were in power and those who had the wealth oppressed the poor, and especially those who were to protect the poor. The kings, the priests, the judges were the very ones who were powerful and wealthy and who were stealing from those who had no power. Some see a direct condemnation of the wealthy Jews who were responsible for crucifying Jesus, the just or the just one in verse 6. This is an interesting interpretation. The Greek can be, we don't have capital letters in the Greek language, and so you don't know if he's talking about just people, that these wealthy landowners were killing innocent people, just people who were not guilty of sins per se, or it could be a direct reference to Jesus. Jesus is described as the just one that the Jews had crucified and slain. And some see this as a reference to the wealthy Pharisees and Sadducees. They didn't want to lose their power to Jesus. And so here were the wealthy people who actually condemned Jesus. Well, regardless, one needs to be aware of the dangers of riches and obviously not to envy those who are wealthy. What are some of the sins that we can look at that are tied into the rich who are being described here in James chapter 5? Well, before we look at that, first of all, we're reminded of the fact that even though people have much in this world's not going to last forever. We know eventually this world's going to be consumed in fire whenever Jesus returns. But even for the short time we live here, food and grain don't last forever. Eventually they rot. We can store up as much grain as we want, but it's going to be useless if we don't eat it. It simply will rot in the bin. Second, garments become moth-eaten. We know this happens. We can hoard or save up all our clothes and so forth, and eventually they're also going to disintegrate. And even gold and silver can lose their beautiful appearance and not appear like they had at one point. And so riches are fleeting, and riches do fade away. And the things of this world we can't protect and save forever. With that in mind, as I mentioned a second ago, let's look at some of the sins that are tied into James chapter 5. The first one, very simply, is injustice. I've always been amazed when I study the Old Testament law, the fact that the Old Testament law obviously is a religious law. God in this law told the Jews how they were to worship, what things were right, what things were wrong, the Ten Commandments, and various other laws. But it also was a civil law. It told the Jews how they had to live on a daily basis, just as we live under civil law in the United States, and those who are in Canada are subject to that government and other countries in the world. The Jews had both a religious and civil law in the Old Testament. But notice how God protects those who are poor in the Old Testament. You shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of the sojourners who are in your land within your towns. You shall give him his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is poor and counts on it, lest he cry against you to the Lord, and you be guilty of sin. And this is the exact same sin that's mentioned in James chapter 5. They withheld the wages. I frequently mention whenever we study this subject, as Jesus said in the so-called model prayer, give us this day our daily bread. Most people in ancient Israel and in the time of Jesus, the common person probably worked that day for what he would feed his family that night. And when you had money and you hired someone to work for you and you failed to pay that person the wage you had promised him, you were guilty of a sin. You were making sure that his family went hungry that night and had nothing to eat. And so injustice is a sin which God very clearly cries out against here in Deuteronomy 24, that it's wrong to keep wages from a person who works for you. Jeremiah 22:13. Woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness and his upper rooms by injustice, who makes his neighbor serve him for nothing and does not give him his wages. Jeremiah prophesied toward the last days of Judah before they were taken into Babylonian captivity. And again, he's not condemning a person here for being wealthy. As a matter of fact, this person's wealthy enough. He has a 2-room house. That's not the condemnation. The condemnation is woe to him who builds this by sin, by unrighteousness, and is not paying his worker the fair amount or the fair wage, the one that he deserves. Malachi 3:5, God says, "Then I will draw near to you for judgment. I will be a swift witness." And notice the sins that are tied into failing to pay workers a fair wage. I'll be a swift witness against the sorcerers, against the adulterers, against those who swear falsely, against those who oppress the hired worker and his wages, the widow and the fatherless, against those who thrust aside the sojourner. Do not fear me, says the Lord of hosts. Notice in all these verses, or at least in this verse and in the first one we looked at, the idea that there are some people who are more at mercy of society. Those who are sojourners, we might refer to them as immigrants, whether not here to debate the question of legal or illegal, but obviously the first generation of any people who come to this country many times come with very little. And they're at the mercy of those who will provide jobs for them. And probably, many of you who are listening to this maybe know the story of your descendants and how they came here and struggled and worked very hard to make a better life for themselves. But at the same time, while they were doing this, not everybody who employed these people obviously were unjust, but there were some individuals who knew they could take advantage of it. That there were so many immigrants who needed jobs that they could pay an unfair wage, they could work them harder because there are always going to be more available to them. And that's what God's talking about here. He's talking about people who would oppress those who are at the mercy of society. And God's people obviously should not be guilty of a sin such as this. There's also another sin, theft. By withholding that wage from that individual, very simply, you're stealing from him the money he earned that day. There's obviously the sin of selfishness. I remember a number of years ago studying in the commentary by Neil Lightfoot on the parable of the foolish man who wanted to tear down his barn and build bigger barns. Christ talks about a man who God blesses. He has this tremendous wealth, so he wants to tear down his barns to build bigger barns. And there's nothing wrong with being blessed by God, but it says tonight your soul is going to be required of you. He obviously was not thinking of anything except that grain. And Brother Lightfoot in his comment made a good point. He says, while this man's trying to decide how big a barn he can build, there's maybe some woman somewhere else in the corner of town wondering how she's going to feed her children that night. And that's something we need to think about. Obviously, communism, socialism is not the answer, but also the fact that we live in a capitalistic society. Obviously, I believe almost all economies are capitalistic in nature to some degree. They almost have to be. We still shouldn't allow that just simply to be selfish and think that, well, so-and-so's on their own and they can support themselves. Those who maybe suffer and are in need of our help. It's actually the sin of murder. As we mentioned, whether Jesus is being described here in James chapter 5 and verse 6, I think it's an interesting take on this, and it's not just in our country, but in every country's history. If you study the history of labor, even before the establishment of unions in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, early 1900s in this country, there were many business owners who literally were guilty of murder. Many times children would work in these factories, going to coal mines, many times 7, 8 years old. That's all the older they were. They're under horrible working conditions, maybe die a very early death, maybe even not get out of their teen years. And yet the person who owned this factory or owned this mine was worth probably millions and millions of dollars. And that would be a sin, putting a person into that kind of a work situation. Obviously, we live in such a different culture today, and we're so blessed by the laws that are there as far as protecting workers and how we should treat one another. That seems so foreign to us. But it was common in many societies and still goes on today throughout the world. And in one sense, when a person does that, when a person mistreats another, puts him in a completely unsafe working condition, knowing his life is at risk and doesn't care about it and doesn't pay him anything, then I think, according to James 5:6, that person could be guilty of murder when that person dies. A man by the name of Spiros Zodhiates, who originally was from Cyprus, has an interesting take on the rich-poor problem in capitalism as we view it. It's a two-slide quote here, but I think it really is biblical and makes a lot of sense. There seems always to have been an employer and an employee. There must have been an original capitalist who put his capital to work for him, and in order to do that, he had to hire servants or laborers. The existence of these two groups of people does not seem to be condemned by the Word of God. What is condemned, however, is the exploitation of the worker by the employer and vice versa. Because the primary target here is the employer, James chapter 5, it does not mean that he is necessarily the only one at fault in the dispute which exists in our management labor disputes. The loafing worker is condemned just as much. There's an established principle of justice and respect for the rights of each other. I've known of people who who maybe were lazy in their jobs, or people who would even steal from their company. Maybe they work for a multi-million or billion-dollar company or corporation. They say, well, they can afford it. They're not going to miss it if I take this or take that. Well, stealing's stealing. It's stealing when the employer fails to pay a fair wage. It's stealing when the employee takes from the employer, regardless of how wealthy that employer is. The employer should not forget that the employee is entitled to a decent wage, and the employee should recognize the right of the employer to make a reasonable profit. The one should not steal from the other. If each one recognized and defended the rights of the other as much as his own, what a wonderful relationship there would be between these two groups of whose cooperation is so essential to the production of that which is necessary for the sustenance of life. And so I think he has sort of a good handle on the Bible view of wealth and money and how we should treat one another as far as employers or employees. So money and or possessions are very simply a neutral commodity. However, the Bible does warn in many places the dangers attached to greed and covetousness. Matter of fact, Paul writes in 1 Timothy that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Open up your newspaper or just look at your computer and see whatever news feeds you read. How many crimes and sins are associated to money? You think about it. Just people stealing for various reasons, whether it be drugs, even human trafficking and so forth. Money's at the root of so many different things that are wrong and evil in this world. Christ warns us about the danger of riches, the cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches, and the desires for other things entering in choke the word and it becomes unfruitful. Here we notice that in this particular section, he's talking about the different hearts or the different soils the seed falls on. And there's a certain heart or soil that initially is good, accepts the word, but allows the deceitfulness of riches to enter in. And how many times have we seen this in Christians' lives that maybe a Christian decides to work a little overtime and miss church because maybe he wants to buy some item. Before you know it, he's putting money and riches above God. Paul warns us in 1 Timothy 6:9, those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. Again, if that's my only goal in life is to make money, and I'm leaving God out of the picture, just as we covered in James chapter 4 a few weeks ago, the idea that the businessman who's going to go someplace here and there and buy and sell and so forth, he says, your life is like a vapor. You ought to say, if the Lord wills, we'll do such. So again, it's not the rich person who's condemned, it's those who desire to be rich. Christ said, again, I say to you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. So again, we're aware of the dangers of riches, and we need to be careful. But as I have mentioned recently, and I really believe, our standard of living, most of us who are listening to this program and most of our friends and those we know are very, very wealthy compared to the rest of the world. You look at the amount of wealth we have. I mean, we have nice houses which have heating and air conditioning. We have vehicles to take us to our jobs. We have so many blessings, more food we know how to eat. We can even afford to eat at other places, have people cook it for us. We have savings account. We have so many blessings that in the first century, the rich person probably was poor compared to what we have today. And so when we think about riches and rich people, let's think about ourselves. It's very easy to look at the multimillionaire, the multi-billionaire, and talk about maybe their greed or how they got there through dishonesty. Some did, some didn't. Some people simply worked hard and knew how to make money, and there's no sin in that. And so we can look at the excesses, the abuses, and understand how wrong that is. But we need to be very careful about being judgmental of other people and their wealth and their money. God reminds us that we need to take care of ourselves and not to be so concerned about others. There really are four classes of people in this world concerning money and concerning God. Those who are rich in this world's goods and poor toward God. And it's true that many times the wealthy don't have God in the picture. Paul explains this in 1 Corinthians 1, where he says, not many mighty, not many wealthy, not many rich or according to this world are called. It doesn't mean that God specifically reaches down and calls certain people, but probably the principle is that the wealthier I am, the more I feel I'm self-sufficient. I'm not dependent on God. For example, if you didn't know where your next meal was coming from and you had no place to live, I'm sure you would turn to God very well or very strongly and pray to help you through that difficult situation. But if I have wealth, if I have servants, if I have anything I want at my disposal, it's easy for me to leave God out of the picture. Second, those who are poor in this world and rich toward God. And that's probably the common situation of the Christians in the first century. Most of the early church was made up of a more humble section of culture and society. Not all of them, but generally speaking, that's what it was. Third, those who are poor in this world and poor toward God. Just because a person is poor does not necessarily mean that person's righteous. You can still be poor and not have God in the picture. As a matter of fact, you might be poor and still blame God for your situation in life. And then finally, those who are rich in this world and rich toward God. Generally speaking, this is probably not a very common, very large number, but there are some Christians who are wealthy and know how to use that gift of stewardship to help others. We're reminded whenever we talk about wealth, as we conclude our lesson, first of all, as employers, if you own a business or you have people working for you, make sure you pay them a fair and livable wage. That's a responsibility. As employees, we have an employer who pays us a wage, then make sure that we work up to what that employer expects out of us and not to steal from that person or to be dishonest or lazy in caring about our duties. But also, let's remember ultimately that we're all stewards of what God has given us. God has given us this world to use, and He's given us many blessings of this world. He's even given us different talents, abilities, the ability to make money and work in our jobs. And let's be good stewards of what God has given us. We thank you for being with us in our lesson tonight. We look forward to having you tune in next Wednesday evening.